All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Confessing Concord, a podcast of Transcendent Truth Media. To find out more about us and who we are and what we're about, you can go to www.transcendenttruthmedia.com. You can also find our merch link there if you're interested. Today we have Connor with us and myself, Stephen. We're talking AC2. Connor, what's that all about?
Yeah, so essentially, we're looking mainly at original sin, and it looks like it's a small article, but as we were discussing, you and I, a few days ago, though it looks small, it's not small. And though some would say, this is just this kind of, on the paper it's small, on the paper not a lot's going on, but we have to recognize, again, as we were doing last week, the context that this is being written in, the people that this is being written to, and their theological presuppositions, their assumptions, their positions. And then when we do that, we realize, oh, hey, this is another one of those edgy hipster, let's go back to the source, ad fontes kind of articles, because this is in that context of the folks who still now today don't believe that concupiscence, and we'll get into what that is, but essentially the desire to sin is sin itself. And so this is here saying, and this is going to be expanded upon throughout the rest of the Book of Concord when this comes up again and again and again, especially in the bigger dogmatic Lutheran tradition, that original sin, like sin itself, this is a whole understanding what sin is itself. It is not just the actions you do with your hands, but it's what's in your heart. And not a lot of theological traditions agree with that. Not a lot of people agree with that. And so you hear them all the time, just like the rich man, the rich young ruler coming to Jesus, Lord, I've kept all these commandments. And he's like, no, you haven't. Because your heart remains sick. And that's how Luther was able to say, even your best works are sins. And that's how Paul was able to say, even your best works are, used tampons, was essentially what he was saying. And so we're coming here and talking about really what is sin, what is sinfulness, and then we're also applying this to the originality, to babies, even to everybody, to creation. So we're going to talk a lot about that, about creationism, traducianism, federalism, realism, and how sin is transmitted. We're going to talk about what sin is. We're going to talk about why sin is. We're going to talk about who isn't a sinner, nobody, and how sin eventually comes into the flesh of Christ and is blotted out there on the cross. Obviously, that's obviously you knew that's what was going to happen when you clicked on this video, didn't you?
Oh yeah. That's the that's like you said. That's the words on the page are one thing. We've got some technical terms, so we'll talk about all those. But at the same time, there's a lot of issues that grow out of this tangential issues, if you will, that come up when you talk about original sin. And like I said, there are massive implications for what saying we are all sinners or original sin is. So with that being said, I'm going to kick this thing off. The first note I was going to make is that when we read it, it says, likewise, they teach that since the fall of Adam, all human beings are propagated according to their nature, are born with sin, that is, without fear of God. Without going forward, we already hit a who's they, and so just to clarify that, like we talked about Article 2. If you're jumping in on Article 2, we recommend going back, watching the video for Article 1. We do some kind of intro about what the book of Augsburg Confession's about. Anytime that we say they teach, they condemn, we are talking about the churches among us teach. So we are talking about the Wittenberg churches, the German churches, the churches in our evangelical teaching are teaching this. So that is the they in view as we go into this.
Yeah, and if anyone's a little bit more, we talked a lot about that actually in the first article, not because it's actually part of the first article's intentions, but just because it's there in the words. When we get to articles, is it 7 and 8 or 8 and I think it's 7 and 8, could be wrong, is we're going to talk more fully about what the church is. But yeah, we do want to bring that understanding back into this, that these are still those churches. This is still that movement of congregations that are teaching the historic, the ancient, the patristic faith, and they're coming back to this and saying, no, 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 no. You can't split up sin, firstly, in mortal and venial. You can't do that. Secondly, you can't split up sin between being concupiscence, which they don't define as sin. These are the ones who are not us. So when you read they, read us, right? Read us. Translate that as us. Is that the Roman Catholics at the time and still now were saying concupiscence isn't sin. And you have so many people, also Baptists, Anabaptists, all kinds of folks who are saying that children are not born in sin. And that's when we get to the article on baptism, and that will come out more fully, but we're going to end up seeing that the Baptists, the Anabaptists, are condemned for that. Not, and it says because they deny that children need baptism to be saved. But well, we'll get more into why that's there. But that's actually about Article 2. That's not actually about the necessity of baptism as a legal necessity for salvation. It's about the need for salvation for kids. That's what that article is referring to. So yeah, and Melanchthon goes on here, right? These congregations among us, we are teaching that since the fall of Adam, and Adam, you should mark that out here, because this is going to get into a lot of what some call rather federal theology, covenantal theology, and that's not a reformed thing. These are things that have to be dealt with. Why is it, and this is why I was saying earlier that notions like creationism, traducianism, realism, federalism are actually so important, and we do actually have a Lutheran consensus on the matter. But anyways, since the fall of Adam, our first father, all human beings, because they're in him. This is in Romans. Is that Romans 3? Romans something. It's in the early chapters of Romans. Sorry, I knocked my camera down here. Or I still knocked it down. It's not, I hate this camera. This camera is a Roman Catholic. So, so all human beings who are propagated, that is, they are born now, according to nature, are born with and in sin. And that's then defined, right? Without fear of God, without trust of God, and with concupiscence. And concupiscence, of course, is just the desire to sin. So we should stop there. I mean, there's a whole lot there to unpack.
Absolutely. Let's see. So they teach that since the fall of Adam. So you already brought up federalism, so might as well go ahead and start there. We'll start at, or do you want to start with creation? We could get in here. As soon as you get to the Adam question, like there's a whole host of.
Well, here's what I think. Here's what I think we should do. Let's leave Adam to the back end, right? Let's do this backwards. I find that this tends to be a really good principle when you're working with the Augsburg Confession, is work with paragraphs linearly, but within the paragraphs work backwards. Right, and that tends to actually work with the way that it's put together. I have no idea why that is, but so we're beginning essentially. Let's break this paragraph in two, because then he starts talking about the disease and original fault, and that's really just a bringing up again what he's already said in the first half of this first paragraph. So we're dealing with what is sin, and on the adverse here, or the inverse, is what is righteousness. What was man created to be? And this, again, this deals with Adam, this deals with creation, this deals with all of that. So we need to go all the way back into the garden. We need to go to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And there in the garden, we find that man is created, Adam is created there. He's created good. He's created in the image and likeness of God. He's created perfect. I know some people would hate to say that. And I don't know why. Do you know why, Stephen? Do you know why some people get so mad when we say that they're created perfect?
So I think we've talked about, not on this podcast, but you and I before have had discussions about theodicy, the idea of justifying God, explaining evil. Why do we have evil? I think the reason people struggle with the idea that Adam is created and Eve are created perfect, or that creation is perfect, is one, we live in a very modern era, post-Darwin. So many people, that's just kind of in their bloodstream and their schooling. So you've got issues of, like, scientifically, they're like, I don't understand how anything could ever be created perfect. But on top of that, if Adam and Eve are created perfect, how do they fall? And so if God creates them perfect and they fall, does that mean God created them with capacity to sin? Did God make them sin?
And is the capacity to sin something that begets or befits perfection? Yeah.
Yeah, and is it just God allowed them to sin? Which I've always, that one, I'll be very honest, comes up very short for me. The difference between allowing and causing is kicking the can down the road when it comes to an all-powerful God. So I think that there's a lot of issues there with, that's why people just I think they're just trying to kick the can down the road, if you will, to be honest. I think they get nervous about talking about, or they just don't understand, how do we talk about God creating a perfect creation that is now not.
Yeah, and you also see that a lot of it is and this, it's kind of the same thing, but a lot of it is tied up with something called probation theory. You've heard of probation theory, right, Stephen?
Yes.
Yeah, it's that idea that God creates them with basically in the mode of possibility, in the mode of, you now have the tools to make this box, but you've not made the box. So now I'm going to ask you to go and do something. And then once you do it, I will reward you. And that reward is usually, probation theorists will oddly say, like heaven, like the intermediate state is the reward. Right. And to me, it's laughable and stupid and absolutely idiotic. But you know why they do that? It's because they want the religion of the law. And it's going to sound like, oh my, Connor is really on his Freudian kick today, breaking everything down to this myopic law gospel distinction. But that's really what it is.
It is what it is.
It is. And that's actually what all of Article 2 is about, right? When you look at dividing concupiscence and sin, like the act and the desire, all you're trying to do is lessen, to soften the law, to say that you can do it because it doesn't matter what's in your heart. And you hear, I don't know what side it is in the homosexuality debate, side B, side D. I don't know. I don't keep up with that stuff. But Sam Alberry and those
the side B
is that they're like, oh well, and this is really common. They're like, oh, it's not a sin to want to be gay, but it's definitely a sin to be gay. And it's like, you have absolutely gone back to Rome on this matter.
Yes, absolutely. But let's be very honest. Those guys are not coming from our evangelical Lutheran context.
No, they're not.
Very much not. So if you take a reformed view of sin, at the end of the day, and if we have any reformed listeners, I'm sorry I'm going to say this because you're going to get upset. But as Francis Pieper notes, when it comes to understanding our works and original sin and things like that, the Reformed oftentimes end up dovetailing back to Rome.
Oh, yeah.
In many ways. You end up horseshoeing back around because, sure, you rightly divide law and gospel, but then you put people back into the law, and now you're back with Rome. I know this because I grew up with this idea of theology. You would have too, actually, now that I think about it. We grew up in that kind of shadow of this. It's not about what you feel in here, but it's like, it's what you do. And I was going to save my furry cards for later in the podcast, but since we've already cracked the can, a good point here to make is that when we talk about the fall of Adam, one of the coolest chapters in Where God Meets Man, actually it's a section within the first or second chapter, is the fall upward. And it's the idea
that's the preface.
That's right. It's the preface. So it's the fall upward. So we didn't fall down to being less than we were. Technically, we gained a new skill set. Humans leveled up in the fall, if you will.
Yeah, the fall was becoming more than we were created to be.
Absolutely. And so, you get this idea that we've fallen upward. And that's really where this all starts. And I think that's a good place to bring this up.
And to put that another way for the listener, if that's maybe you just want to hear it phrased another way, because I know coming from a legal perspective, that can be so nuts. Think about it this way, is that the fall is not a fall from the mode of possibility to the mode of necessity into sin, which is how Augustine phrases it. I forget the Latin. I hate Latin so much, but it's like, You were created where you could sin but didn't need to. Now, as a sinner,
Posse non peccare,
yeah,
not able to sin.
yeah,
Then after the fall, you are not able to not sin.
yeah. Or you start able. No, wait. You start able not to sin, then you're not able not to sin, and then you go back to, in Augustine's framework, to not able to sin. So you go from mode of possibility, mode of necessity to sin, mode of necessity not to sin. And that's Augustine's framework, which is shared not just by Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, but the Reformed too.
Yeah, and that's one thing I'll note right there is that the Reformed actually follow Augustine much more closely on this point than Lutherans do. So that's Luther, the most cited church or the most cited author in all of Luther's works is Augustine. Second's Bernard of Clairvaux, if you're just interested in those kind of things. But it's Augustine. But this is one point where Luther will say things like, and Blessed Augustine says this, but, and then kind of rephrase and turn away from that. So Calvin actually, if you look in like the Institutes, follows this framework very closely.
Yes, he does.
In his understanding.
And that's how the Reformed doctrine and evangelical doctrine of sanctification is formed in their Ordo Salutis, their order of salvation. Yeah. 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 Whereas in the Lutheran understanding, as we were just referencing Ferdy's Where God Meets Man, you're not falling from the mode of possibility to the necessity to sin, but you're moving from let's not even call it a mode, but the state of receiving grace and goodness and gift upwards to the mode of possibility so that you can realize how horrible that is. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is really the move from childhood to adulthood, right?
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, that's one of the things that, like I said, so I'll be honest, that was the first Ferdy book I ever read, was Where God Meets Man.
I think it's the best one.
I think it probably is. I mean, at least for introducing people to Ferdy, I absolutely believe it's the best one. It's the most understandable. When you get into his essays and stuff, people oftentimes will read his books and they'll be like, oh, okay. Then you start getting into the compilations of essays and you're like, this just went up a level. So, so that's your pitch for the day. If you're interested in these topics in Ferdy, start with Where God Meets Man. And there's a newer edition as well, so you don't have to read the older 1974 typeface.
That's right. That's right.
I have the newer edition and the older edition.
Yeah, I bought for Roland's birthday. Actually, I bought him a copy of the anniversary edition and mailed it to him.
It's really nice, and it has all kinds of discussion questions, so it's really good for a study if anybody's interested in that. Anyway, back to topic. So yeah, we've covered kind of that we're talking about the fall of Adam. As all human beings are propagated according to nature, are born with sin. So here is this where you want to get into federalism?
Let's start this way, actually. Let's start with federalism and realism.
Okay.
What and how and why am I counted as a sinner and made a sinner because of what Adam did?
Yep.
The answer is in here, listener. It's in here. Langton says the word.
It is. Well, let's see. The Latin uses propagated. This is once where I'll jump over to the German for our explanation. Furthermore, it's taught among us that since the fall of Adam, all human beings who are born in the natural way are conceived and born in sin. So Melanchthon is taking the position that there is a certain sense in which by natural conception and natural birth, there is a transmission of the sinful nature. It has become inherent to what humans are in the fallen state.
Now, Jesus doesn't have that.
Jesus does not.
Why might that be if you asked Melanchthon?
If you ask Melanchthon, it would probably have something to do, in his understanding, with Jesus not having an earthly father in the same way the rest of us have an earthly father.
Yes, and the debate really here is over the mechanics of how this works. Everybody pretty much agrees up to that point, except the reference of natural birth. Not always, not really, because the word federal means covenantal. And within a covenant, a family covenant, and there's different kinds, you don't have to be the natural father of your children to be their covenant head, right? You
Right.
really don't. You can be an adoptive father, you could be a stepfather, you could be whatever else, right? And you can still be the covenant head of that individual. And so the whole problem with the federalist covenantal understanding of why sin is given in that way is that it doesn't follow. And so you end up getting a lot of people asking questions, well, why would it be this and that? Whereas what's called realism is the idea that the sin is transmitted in almost in a way in the flesh, really, is that it is in that fallen flesh and the being, and the nephesh comes out of one another, and this actually goes back further, and so nobody is picking federalism because they want to, but they're picking federalism because they have to, because it's necessitated by something called creationism over and against what's called traducianism. And creationism is not young earth creationism. It's not,
No,
it's not, it's not that. What we are talking about is what a human being is and how they are made, right?
Good.
And that means body and soul. And some people have tried to split it up and said, the body is created through traducianism, and we'll get to what that is in a second. And then the soul is created by creationism. Whereas others tried to keep it as a whole, as a nephesh. And the Lutheran tradition is one of those. To my knowledge, I don't know of any Lutheran writers espousing creationism and federalism, but I guarantee you there's a whole lot of pastors who have read just too much Calvin or something.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I don't know of any that are explicitly writing that, and any who are arguing for that probably came up with it by accident. Because I'll be honest, this is a very I don't mean this in a derogatory, but this is a very reformed question to ask. It's like when you talk about an ordo salutis, or you talk about, well, how do we understand the order of salvation? To be honest, it's a very un-Lutheran question in many ways. So if we're going to get into the mechanics, though, a little bit of definition for federalism is the idea that Adam is a representative head of the human race. And so because he was the representative head, because we are all some way under the category of Adamness, if you will, to put it very simply, that necessitates that because he was our federal head and he sinned, we are now all sinners. Categorically, there's nothing real to it, as Connor's referencing realism. There's nothing real to it. It's just he was your federal head. He has sinned, therefore now human beings are sinful because Adam, being the first representative man, made us all sinful.
And this is actually the same way that the Reformed understand the gospel too, and
yes,
imputation.
Absolutely.
As what people make fun of them, they say it's a legal fiction. And when I look at that and I look at the Reformed and the evangelicalism, like it kind of is, like what they're espousing kind of is a legal fiction.
Yeah.
Because they don't believe that there's any real actual taking on of the sin into the flesh of Christ. None of that.
Because Jesus comes along, and Jesus is now once again a federal head,
a representative
for the human race. So that's why I think we get so many interpretations where they read Corinthians and Paul saying he became sin who did not know sin, and going, it doesn't actually mean Jesus took on sin. He stayed pure and he took the punishment for our sin, but did not take the sin into himself. And it's like, well, that's not what the text says. But then again, when you've already thrown out the sacramental understanding of
or the gospel as plainly
put
in the text,
or the gospel is plainly put in the text.
well, this is the thing, right? Is that it's that hermeneutic difference of, do you have a perpetual pattern and habit of unbelief? Well, then I'm not going to be surprised when you start looking at niche
Exactly.
texts and
Exactly.
disbelieving them. Yeah, so and the reason why Lutherans, in my opinion, this is skeptical, or not skeptical, what's the word? This is speculative, is the
Okay.
reason that they were so insistent upon defending traducianism, where Rome in the past didn't take a position on it. They said you can hold either view. The Lutherans took a view, and I think that the reason they did that was to defend the realness of the gospel. That's my
Yeah.
opinion. Yeah.
I think that's a good. I mean, that's why personally, whether that's what Melanchthon and Chemnitz and
Yeah.
our scholastic forefathers would say. That's where I would go with it.
Yeah.
That you and I were mentioning the other day about you and I were mentioning the other day. What was it about the fleshness things
Yeah.
being taken in the flesh? That when you have a fleshly understanding of the gospel, if you will, and that's a very Freudian kind of thrust. So if you understand that the gospel, that Christ became flesh and came down, and baptism and salvation and faith are given in water, and that we are given faith in bread and wine, this should be a very revolutionary idea. This is a natural extension of those things.
Yeah. Does your gospel have legs?
Right. And so we were talking about federalism. So we kind of gave a basic definition of that. So creationism versus traducianism. So basically, these two things are: creationism is the idea that basically the soul is planted, if you will. That there is not the soul is not transferred in the natural processes. There is at some point, and they don't ever really define when it happens, and that's why I think just naturally this is a bad footing to start with anyway. That the soul is implanted at some point. Traducianism is the idea, and I think is the kind of traditional idea of the church by and large. Like I said, Roman Catholicism never really took a standpoint, but I think it's more inherent to their doctrine than creationism would be, is the idea that we are holistic in some ways. So we have, through natural processes, the soul is a part of that and is transferred. So by the fact that you are human and you were born naturally, you have a soul, and you have original sin in that soul because Adam became sinful, and as he propagates, as our getting back to the language of the confession, you get a transference of that original sin in a real way, and that's where our realism comes in. That there is a real change.
There's a real change and a real transfer.
Yeah, which affects us physically. I mean, there are some writers these days, some of them are Lutheran, some of them are not, but talking about like dealing with embodiment and sin, and like that there are physical side effects to
like dying and disease.
Yeah, like dying and disease. Like life, there were changes that were real changes that needed a real remedy.
Yeah, and these are very real, very tangible, very physical, very actual things that are happening. And the where this really I guess hits the ground running is on the insistence of what sin is. And we look here, not only is it concupiscence, but it's being without fear, without trust, is that this is the negative of what should be. And this gets down to the definition of what is good, what God creates, and what sin is. Sin is not something, it's negation, it's a lack of something. Absolutely. And what's interesting here is that concupiscence, people would say it is something, it's the desire to do something, but that desire to do something is to lack fear and to lack trust, and to lack hope and righteousness in that. And that gets more spoken about in the Apology. And then they teach, of course, that this disease, this original fault, is truly sin, and it now damns and brings eternal death to those who are not born again through baptism and the Holy Spirit. Of course, this includes the Word. This includes whatever way the means of grace come at you and birth you anew by water and the Spirit, not only in baptism, but also by the Word preached, also by I would say it does work. It is valid even by the supper, though that is not proper. Please don't do that, but it will work. And so the whole notion here is that you need to be born again. You need to have the means of grace work upon you to kill you and raise you. And of course, then he goes on, we condemn the Pelagians and anyone else who denies the original fault is sin, and who, or that means original guilt. That includes Ulrich Zwingli, by the way, Calvinists, who, in order to diminish the glory of Christ's merits and benefits, argue that human beings can be justified before God by their own powers of reason. But then to go back a bit, that also extends to babies. So just to put it shortly, and then I'll let you close up for us here, that includes babies. There is no age of accountability. There is no time when you are innocent before you've done actual sins. There is no room to say that you are not a sinner, because as Paul says, in Adam all die. In Adam, who you are in, by birth, by natural birth, by a result of being the product, the fruit of Adam, you are dead. You're born dead. And so every single breath that you now breathe, you breathe only to make war with God. You have this concupiscence. You lack fear of God. You lack trust in God, and you have the desire to do what is not right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the couple things to address in that, first, original sin. Functionally, all sins are original sin. They are a retelling of, or a reenactment of original sin, which was that fall upward. And ultimately, it comes down to basically pride. We decide that we know better, or that the rules do not apply to us, or that we rehash that fall upward, if you will. And so that's where, like you said, the original fault is truly sin. I will say this article is a very much out of Luther. If you look and talk about, it's not the individual deeds. This kind of gets back to your discussions of Albury and different discussions with side B. So you can actually look at Luther in Freedom of a Christian, and he says that it is not, it's not deeds that make you good. It is God that makes you good. It's the Word recreating you that makes you good, and therefore your
creeds, not
good.
Deeds.
And so this is all that to say, this is an article that's very much out of Luther and is following Luther pretty closely, and you get that even moving into and brings eternal death to those who are not born again through baptism of the Holy Spirit. This is why we baptize our babies. And then Pelagians get condemned. Pelagians get condemned a lot in the Augsburg Confession for multiple reasons. I mean, you've got Pelagius, who basically denies the efficacy of baptism. For one, that's a big one that historically a lot of people don't realize. Plus the idea that they deny original sin. And this is a problem, because if you look around and if you look in Scripture, it's pretty clear. It's a pretty cut and dry case, I think.
Yeah, it's just to sum it up just once more in regard to baptism, is that what this article has to say to you in application, as an evangelical would say, is no matter what you do with your hands, you will not remove the actual problem, which is your heart. Yes. And that problem existed within you since you were created, since before you took a breath. What it is to say is that the game is fixed. And a lot of people hate that, but that has the power to actually free you when you realize that. And what we were speaking about in the beginning, all those people who hate this, all those people who hate the garden, really, all those people who have probation theory, or who have this or who have that, what they're trying to do is do that upward fall. I'm not even going to call it an upward fall, really. All those people are trying to climb the ladder up there to usurp God and to become him, to literally to engage in theosis, right?
Yeah.
And so they are trying to deify themselves by being in the mode of possibility, that they are now the sole arbiter or the co-arbiter, right? That they, rather than God, is the one who will decide their fate, or at least that they can have some say in the matter, but they can't. And it's only when you realize that you are dead from the start that you need to go back to the created order. Remember, as I was saying, we weren't created in the mode of possibility, but in that state of being the one who is given gifts. And until we are able to realize that we are back in that place, then we will have always constantly just bad news thrown back at us. And in fact, that bad news is all that comes out of us because of original sin. And so all of the attacks against this on regard to baptism or age of reason or whatever, it has to do with people trying to climb the ladder of the law up to their own divinity. And it has to do with the false doctrine of theosis, which I cannot drag through the mud enough. It's not possible. It's yeah. And so, just as a close, are you good if we close it here? I think we've done something constructive here. Maybe 30 minutes. We were on 40 minutes, but the text is small a little, so I think we're justified there. So let's close it here. And just the closing word, I suppose, is as we move into the doctrine of the Son of God, of Christ, as we move into the doctrine of justification and the ministry and the church and all of this good news, don't let that bad news of Article 2 pass you by. Like the structure here, even though this isn't a Lutheran structure, don't miss it. We start with the holy God. We move to you who are broken and sinner from birth. Like the game is rigged and you're in a bad state. And then that gospel needs to hit you there as the one who is not in the mode of possibility and who never will be. And it's in fact, you're trying to be in that mode of possibility that brought you that condemnation. So my closing word is hear the words of the law and let them kill you. Yeah.
It's a good Lenten message.
It is. Yeah. Are we good? We're good?
I think so.
All right. Head over, everyone, to our website, to our Facebook page, our Instagram page. We have unique content on the Instagram page, by the way. And we also have a Discord channel up now. So all of that you can find in the description, the podcast or the video description. So God bless all of you. And next time we come back, we'll be talking about Christ himself, the one who saved us, and his work, his person, and all of that good stuff. So anyways, peace to everybody.